Welcome to another Syncom Smalltalk tutorial. What we're going to go through today is the inspector, which is a common tool between VisualWorks and Object Studio. One thing that we need to point out is that if you go back to old enough versions of Object Studio, the inspector is going to look a little different than what you see in this screencast, and that's because older versions of Object Studio used a different tool. In later versions of both VisualWorks and Object Studio, these two tools were unified into one common tool used across both VisualWorks and Object Studio. So with that in mind, let's close this little screen here and we'll go to the product. What we've got here is a little application we built in one of the last screencasts, our counter, and what we want to do is test this out and figure out how it works by doing some basic testing using the inspector. What we're going to do is go to a Workspace, which is another tool we'll be making a little bit of use of. So we'll go to page new so we don't mess around with the basic text here. I'll make this tool a little bigger, and what we're going to do is just create a new instance. Now you'll notice that I'm not assigning this new instance to a variable, and there's a reason for that that I'll get to in a few minutes. What we're going to do is highlight this and do an inspect. Notice that there are a couple of options here to execute. I can just do it, which would execute, print it, which would put the result of whatever that expression is in the workspace, and inspect it, which will bring up an inspector. So let's do that. We get this little inspector tool, and again, we'll make this a little bigger. What you have here is two panes. Over here you have the attributes and pieces of that object. This object has only one instance variable, so we only have one attribute, count, which its current value is 0. Over here you notice how it's printing counter and we have that angle bracket 0. Now the reason that happens is we've got a print on method and we've customized our print on to do this. Now if you don't have a print on method, whatever the one in object does, which is just going to be putting the class name, so you'd see a counter would go in there, or if it started with a vowel, you would see an, whatever it is. So you'll see a counter, an ordered collection, that sort of thing. Over here, what you'll see is the attributes. What we're going to do is we're going to mess around with some of the things in the menu up here and see what we can do. So up here you'll notice there's a refresh. That's if you want to refresh the view, if you've made any changes. If you hit browse, notice what happens. I've selected count. I'm going to get a browser on small integer. The reason for this is that it's context sensitive. Close that down, select self, and watch what happens. Object, browse. I get a browser on counter because again, my context is what I've got selected here. Likewise, down further, I've got inspect and inspect owners. Owners is an interesting one. If you have an object and you want to know who's referencing that particular object, you'll see here in this case nobody, because the only reference to it is in this workspace. I didn't hold it in the workspace, so we've got nothing there. The edit menu doesn't have a whole lot of surprises. Select all is a little interesting. You can go in here and notice that if I select everything, I get the printable representation of every object over there, whereas if I select just one, I get the printable representation of whatever that is. The Go menu, I have this option to dive. Well, dive works the same way as double clicking. So if I take this count and I double click, I'm going to drill one level down to whatever that object is. In this case it's an integer, so I drill down to small integer. If I don't know where I am, or I want to go back to where I was, notice I have these forward and back buttons. I can go back to my previously visited place. Also in history, if I've been drilling down, going back up, I have a more complex object, perhaps I have something like a person class that has an address, and the address is itself an object which has attributes, and I can drill way down in that. I can always get a history, so I want to say, well, that's where I was, let's go back here. So I can always visit any place. This tool keeps track of everything I do. I can also go to the Explore menu. Notice that right now it's focused on this object. I can change it to the parts and get back to this kind of view here, so it breaks this out to self is this guy, count. Notice how it changes this view over here. And if I don't like that, I can always go back to the focus. Tools menu has an interesting thing here. Notice this evaluation pane. And again, everything is duplicated on the toolbar. I can go here or I can go to Tools. Either way, if I get this, I'm going to get a little workspace pane down here, which is equivalent to this workspace, only its context is what's in here. So let's go back. So I have my counter object instead of being on the small integer. And if I do something like self count and I say let's change it to 8, I can do this, do it. Now you might wonder, why isn't it updating? Well, that's why the refresh option is here. So I do that, notice it updated to 8, and now I have that guy in here. So I can mess around with code down here, I can make changes. So if I'm debugging an application and I want to change some state, so maybe it's hard to get the state changed because it requires a database connection and it requires me to do a specific set of long-winded queries, and I'd just like to change some state to something and test it, I can do that in the inspector tool. Another thing you can do that not a lot of people seem to be aware of is this. let's say that I did this. I don't have a reference to this guy in the workspace, and I wanted to just write some scripting code here in the workspace instead of all down here in this little pane, because maybe I wanted to save this code out to a file, which I can do with the page option up here. Well, what I can do is I can drag from this tool anything. So I'm dragging self, meaning the entire counter object. And notice how the option lit up here is something I can do. I want to drop it on here, and it's going to prompt me, say, what do I want to call this? Well, let's call it my counter. Now if I go over here, notice in variables, I have my counter. The current value is 8. So if I go back over here, and let's change this to self count gets, say, 10, and we'll do an execution on that. And this will show you that if I refresh this here, notice that's 10, and if I click on and off this, so let's do a click off, click on, notice it's again changed the value here. So it's the same object. I dropped it from here to here, and I can now play around with it in my workspace under the name my counter. So I can say my counter subtract 1, because I had that method that I support, so I can do this. And if I go to variables, notice it's now got a value of 9, and over here, again, value of 9. So I can work back and forth between inspector and workspace, and that's probably the most powerful feature of that, combined with the evaluation pane, because that way I can take objects that were maybe hard to get to in my application, drag them over to a workspace, and then do ad hoc testing. Especially if you're working with an end user on the line. They say, I've done these, say, 25 things in my application to get to this state, and I can't figure out why thus and such is happening. Well, you can sort of drill your way there faster by creating your object and just messing with the variables to get them to the state that matches what the user has, and then trying to duplicate the behavior. So that should give you a good background on the inspector, the workspace, and some of the functionality that trades between the two, and get you started with using this tool in Syncom Smalltalk. So that's about it for today.